Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How you doing, Ken?
Good. I'm really good. Thank you for asking, Rory. I hope you're well too, Rory. And both Rory and I hope that you are well listening to this. You've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We're at episode 254, where we're going to be delving into three different topics today, starting off with closing a therapy session. And that, of course, goes into our theory to practice section of our podcast, where we look at how theory applies itself in real life counselling. And then in practice today, where we look at contemporary challenges, issues, things that are of this moment in counseling. We speak about counseling somebody that may have a celebrity status, somebody that is maybe recognizable, maybe in mainstream media, maybe from a film or something like that. And then in practice matters, that's the CPD part of today's podcast. We have a really interesting topic. It's an interview with Catherine Samson on, I'm going to have to say this slowly so I get it right because it's a big word, psychotherapeutic. There you go. I got it. Psychotherapeutic needs of mothers returning to work after maternity leave. So that is definitely worth sticking around for. But starting off with that theory and practice, the ending of a session, or the art, Rory, of closing a therapy session. Is it an art?
It is an art. It is an art, Ken, and I think it speaks to something called deliberate practice, and that was a term, I guess, that first came into the vocabulary of psychotherapists in 2016 with the publishing of the book Deliberate Practice for Psychotherapists, a guide to improving clinical effectiveness. And it was written by an American counselor called Tony Rausmarini, if I pronounced his name correctly. And what deliberate practice really is to be really thoughtful of how you work, how you use any of the skills or approaches within therapy, and getting feedback on them and developing them and honing those skills. Getting that craft really a really high quality point, if you like. I'm thinking of someone who's a furniture maker or a cabinet maker, beautifully finishing off the work that they do. So it's absolutely lovely. And closing a counselling skills session, as we both know, Ken, certainly for students can be tricky. There's a lot of pitfalls. And the first observation I make, and I don't know if you'd agree with me, Ken, is that when we think of closing a session, we need to be thinking of that right from the beginning of our engagement. And that can be something as simple as having a clock or some kind of time measuring device behind the client, because there's nothing worse, is there, than not knowing how long you've got.
Yeah.
And we as humans, we're not very good at counting the time. I mean, there must be some people who've got a chronometer in their head, but generally speaking, I don't know about you, but I need some kind of time measuring device. And we don't want people looking at the phones or looking at the watches when they're, connected with a client. We don't want to be in a situation where we're dropping out of process. So just I used to take a little alarm clock with me and switch the alarm off, obviously, and have it placed behind the client so that when I was looking at the client, I could just slightly look away and see what the time is. So setting up, the ending in advance, thinking forward and using that deliberate practice, I think is essential as a first point, Ken.
Oh, yes. And I guess, I mean, each and every session we hold is going to have an endpoint to it. And we would generally contract before we even start working with a client with how long a session is. But a client can have material that they're bringing. Sometimes, and you were speaking about students, Rory, I know from students that we have taught, may suggest, oh, I didn't want to interrupt, and it was okay for me to go 5 minutes over, and it was okay for me to go 10 minutes over. And of course, we're speaking about moving past boundaries that have been set in. When we first contract with that client, we say maybe they have 60 minutes within a therapy session. Within mine, I would say that'll be 5 minutes to say hello and check in, and then I'll let you know 5 minutes before the ending so we can kind of wrap that up. So we kind of contracted to that therapeutic time that we're going to be spending. And when we overrun of that, we are starting to move those boundaries. And what kind of a signal might that send to the client? And I understand we may be willing and we may want to maybe be there. We might not have another client coming after that. But what can happen when we fall into those habits is that when we do become busy, or maybe take up another position or a job in an agency where we do have a number of clients one after another, we have to factor in that we need to, after a client leaves, maybe process and maybe put some notes down and prepare ourselves to be ready for the next clients. It's unfair to future clients if we're overrunning, and of course to the client that we contracted and gave the boundaries to in the first place. Not wanting to interrupt, as I've already mentioned, feeling that you don't want to look at your watch. What kind of a signal might that send to a client? Oh, I'm so bored of what you're saying, I'm now going to look at my watch to see when this is going to end. So there are some tricks here that you can use. One trick is sometimes you can look at the client's watch. You don't need to be able to see it in great detail to understand where the hands are. So you don't need to be able to read the minutiae of that, but you can sometimes see on a client's watch. If you wear your watch backwards so that the actual watch face sits on your wrist, it's easier to glimpse the time. But as you said, Rory, best practice is keeping your time by having a timekeeping device, a clock. I'm using big words today, big therapeutic words, timekeeping device, Rory, that you can see. And when I first took this to supervision, what we kind of came out with was that I, in my practice, also want a clock that the client can see. And within my practice, when I was running it, a client had a choice of where they would sit. So whatever seat you sat in, there was a clock there. And within your sight, without having to strain to look at it. And the reason for having a clock that the client can see is because the client also then is able to see when the end of that session is coming, because they know the time boundaries, and they might self-regulate of maybe something that they'll keep for next time rather than delve into now, rather than giving what we call a doorknob ending, where they kind of drop something heavy in at the end. I guess that those are parts of the art of that closing a session, Rory.
Absolutely, and yes, you're absolutely right. Having a clock in sight of both yourself and the client is important. Absolutely, the reasons you've outlined, Ken, which is so both people are aware of the time, but also so the client can self-regulate. Because when the client is in process and talking about things that are really, really hard, at the end of the session, they have to return back to their lives. They have to, leave your practice rooms, or if you're online, they'll have to turn off whatever, Zoom or whatever device they're using to contact you online, and they'll have to re-engage with their own lives. And I think it's really important that as a therapist, you're thinking about kind of winding the session down, bringing them back into that area where they can re-engage with their lives, and both of you finish, and the client goes off and catches a bus to go home, or picks their children up, or goes shopping, or does whatever people do when they leave therapy. And that is another reason why it's so important that we keep time, because client may have something else to do. They may have squeezed that hour in, and after the hour, they may leave, and they may, say, go and pick the kids up, or go shopping, or go home, or go back to the office. So it's really important that we keep that hour in. And I think also mentioning how long the session is at the beginning of the session, saying, we've just got around 50 minutes, and I'll give you an indication as we come into the end. I'll just remind us both, I guess, that we're coming to the end. So the therapist is taking soft power. I'll call it soft power. They're taking soft power, and they're saying to the client, I'll help manage this for you. And then at the session comes to close, as you say, we've just got about 15 minutes left. And it's a point where the client can say, well, I've only got 15 minutes with the therapist, so what do I need to do? And it's giving control back to the clients, as opposed to just letting them free flow. And, you get to the end, and they're still stuck in process, and they've got to go out into the world. So it is deliberate practice. It is, I'm going to use the term, using soft power to kind of bracket the process.
I like it. I like the word soft power, because yes, there is a holding of that space, and that's what we're called on to do. We're holding that professional space, and it occupies a time that has been agreed by both counselor and client. So there's no surprises there. And I guess what is maybe less respectful to the client is a term like, oh my goodness, wow, we've only got a minute left of the session. Sorry, where has the time gone? Wow, it really flies. We are there to hold that time professionally and to give that indication that we are approaching the end of the session, and leaving enough time within that we are approaching the end of the session to be able to use the skill perhaps of summary to retouch on what the client has brought, so that they leave with a little neat package of our understanding of what they've brought. Maybe that refreshes their memory of what the session entailed. And it's respectful. And then you might pop that over to the client and saying, now with that, and looking back on the session and touching on all these points that you brought today, I wonder in our last 5 minutes, how you feel as you get yourself ready for going out into your life and back into your world. So there's a preparation, almost like a holding space there. And it's kind of directed, saying, we've covered that. How might you be feeling as you transition back in? So we're once again acknowledging that closing of the session. And it can be that the client might bring heavy material right towards the end. It happens. That's the real life of counseling. Something that you might say, I wonder how you are as you now going back in, and the client may say, well, I actually wanted to speak about the loss of my mother. And we're now in the last 5 minutes. And as the therapist, we can receive that, and we can recognize that and say, wow, I hear that you want to today maybe to have spent some time speaking about your mother. I recognize that there's probably a lot to go into there, and with only 5 minutes left, I wonder if that would be okay for you to bring that next time. If you choose to bring that, we can really look into it. So there's a way of kind of signposting and recognizing if there is heavy material towards the end of the session, that it's not going to be ignored and, oh, sorry, time up, thank you, next. But there is a holding of, I recognize that, we can look at that again. It's a way of kind of sticking to the boundary of the ending, but respectfully acknowledging that material that maybe there wasn't time for has been brought towards the end of the session.
I like that, Ken. And I think also there's an opportunity to segue. You can say, you brought something that I think needs the respect to look at it with a little bit more time. Perhaps we could look at that in our next session if you wanted another session. And then, the client could say yes. And then when you start the next session up, if you've said that, if you both agreed it's to be inspected and looked at, you might start the next session by saying, I'm aware that at the end of the last session, you talked about, the death of your mother. And I just wondered if that was something you wanted to speak about. It's up to you. And the client can say yes or no. And I think that's useful. And I think one of the things that, Ken and myself have observed, which is a bit of a rookie error, is that over helpful counsellor who comes to the end of a session, really wants to help, really putting heart and soul into the session, and says, is there anything else? Is there anything else you want to talk about? And I can remember observing a counselling session, counselling skills session as a tutor. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Came to the end, just closing on time. I thought, this is going to be great. And the person who was in the role of helper, counsellor, said, is there anything else that you need I can help you with? And the person went off on another tangent, and the student looked at me and said, well, what do I do now?
Yeah.
And I said, well, what would you do? And it was a really good learning opportunity. I think sometimes if you're in a helping profession, you want to help. And, client comes to you and can I give you any more help? Because I want to help. And sometimes just being a bit, taking the foot off the power pedal and applying the handbrake, is, to use a motoring term, is sometimes more useful than just speeding ahead. It's an interesting and important part of practice, ending a session, and I think it does fall under deliberate practice, Ken. Strategizing, thinking about it before you engage with the clients.
Definitely. And I think part of that deliberate practice and looking at the art, and I love the word you've chosen, the art of closing a session, Rory, is to recognize that there may sometimes be high emotion within the client. The client may have brought material that is heavy, and they may be emotionally distraught. They may feel worse than when they come in the first place. So having that ending time, those 15 minutes, those 10 minutes, whatever you decide within your practice, that's time where you might work on how that person might deal with that outside of the therapy room until we next meet. It might be a time where you might need to make a referral if something has come up. The ending is a really important part of the session, and it can take on many different flavors. I think of songs as an example. Some songs play and then they just stop, some fade out, some of them will go back into recurring verses. There's different ways of doing it, and you need to find what's right for your practice, but also recognize what is right for the client, the idiosyncrasy of the clients that will sit in front of you. They're all going to be different and react differently to the endings. Deliberate practice, I think, is the big word, Rory.
Yeah, that's definitely the takeaway. And deliberate practice means practicing, honing. You know, if you're a student, it's about getting feedback. You know, I've always said feedback's the breakfast of champions, and getting feedback. And also, if you're a qualified practitioner, or if you're a student and you're in your placement, take endings as a topic to supervision. Explore and examine how you're ending. I know some people take recordings in. It sometimes happens, but I think it's important to focus on those skills. And I like how you've mentioned bringing in other skills, so summarizing, use of questions, silence. All very, very important when we're bringing things to an end and getting the client ready to re-engage with the life outside therapy. Really important.
It is. And as we come to the end of this topic, see what I did there, Rory?
You did. It's really good, Ken.
We have a handout for you. Rory created a super duper handout. It is called Closing a Counselling Session. It's a little PDF that you can download. If you want to get that handout on closing a counselling session, go to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. That's where Rory and I hang out on a day-to-day basis. Click on the podcast tab, make your way to episode 254. That's today's episode. Right there on the page is all the show notes, links to more detailed information on the topics Rory and I speak about. But right there at the top, you can actually download free of charge the little PDF handout on closing a session that Rory has made for you. And I guess that brings us to the end of that. And we now go into our practice today, Rory, where we look at something we may face in this world of counselling. And today you've chosen the topic, I think, from our Facebook group on counselling celebrities.
Indeed, it's interesting. We have a Facebook group, and if you don't know about our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. We're a closed group, but knock on the door, we'll let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have students, we have qualified colleagues, we have supervisors, we have tutors, and they all talk about different topics, very important topics within our world of counselling and psychotherapy. And over the years, I have to say, I picked up themes where someone might say, "I wonder what I'd do if I was counselling X, somebody who's in the public eye." And when we're talking about celebrity, we're talking about people in the public eye. And it struck me the other day that we have more people in the public eye than probably ever before. When I was younger, we had 2 television stations, a couple of radio stations, a couple of newspapers, no internet, and that was it. There was no social media, nothing. And now, some people on YouTube have more views than some people who are in mainstream TV. And those people are recognizable. I think the term familiar to millions, to use an Oasis album term, is a useful term here, familiar to millions. What happens if you're counselling someone who you seen on the TV or seen on social media? And it's a really interesting thought, because a few years ago, I was visiting a friend of mine who runs a very busy practice, turned up to have something to eat in the evening. And I was given the time to arrive, and I turned up. And when I say it's a busy practice, there's lots of therapists working out of this practice, lots and lots and lots. And I turned up, and as I was going towards the door opened, and a person walked out. And they kind of stared at me and wandered off. And I thought, I wonder if they recognise me from my YouTube or Counselling Tutor, because there's lots of therapists there. And then I realised it wasn't me they were recognising. I'd actually seen them on the TV the previous night.
Yeah.
And they were probably looking at me to think, oh, gosh, I hope that person doesn't recognise me. I'm guessing it might not be the case. And it is very, very difficult. And it's recently come up in a supervision that someone I'm supervising is supervising a celebrity. And one of the things we had to work over was, is there a dual relationship going on?
Yeah.
Because we don't counsel people we know for a very, very good reason, because we're invested in them. But if you're counseling someone who you watch on the TV every single night, or you've watched for years, you have to ask yourself, is this a dual relationship? Who am I counseling? Am I counseling the character, or am I counseling the person? And I think you really have to sit and think about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's so much to consider with this. So we're speaking about that some subconscious processing of who do we see that person as.
Yeah.
Here we're using as an example, maybe somebody from the TV or the radio, also an author of a book, but it can be anybody that is known to you as upstanding in a niche or an area. How do you look at that person? So if I was to say, if I bumped into Lance Burton, I would have a great difficulty in speaking with him without great reverence in my voice. You would probably, listening to this, go, who is Lance Burton? And I'm sure you're thinking, Rory, who's Lance Burton? And Lance Burton is one of the icons of magic, prestidigitation, sleight of hand. And I had a great interest in that for many, many years of my life. And I used to follow him, and he won the world championship. So he may not be known to you or many of our listeners, Rory, but known to me. So how would I see them? And I guess when we're looking at this celebrity, how do you see that person? Who are they to you? And are you able to see them without a filter of their character, what you may have seen in the press, what other people even may have said about that person? So they don't have to be mega famous. They just have to be known to you, or a part of them known to you. And I think that's really, really interesting. And then if the person is recognized by recognizable to millions, as you mentioned, Rory, from the Oasis song, then I think there's further considerations if we're working in a practice of how is confidentiality held. If you have somebody that maybe meets the person in the waiting room, would they, guess who was in today? And I'm sure they wouldn't, and they would keep that confidentiality. But could it be that they would leave the session and walk out to the press, being outside, that the information has been leaked out of where they are? I think there's additional professional considerations that we might put in place if working with somebody that might be recognizable.
Indeed. And of course, we must take on board the, shall we say, the slightly Machiavellian aspect of this, which is, people in the public eye have PR and press. Yeah. And, what would happen if you've opened your newspaper or turned on your social media and there was a picture of your client walking out of your practice saying such and such a body's having therapy? Initially, you might think, the snoopy press, those terrible people in the press are hounding my client. It might be the opposite. It might be the client has decided to release this information to the public.
Yeah.
For shall we be thoughtful and say maybe because they wanted to raise awareness of therapy. So we have to be very, very thoughtful. And I think as we come to sort of close this topic, many years ago, I had a friend who met a celebrity that they'd idolized for years. And there's an old saying, never meet your heroes. Yeah. Because when they met them, they were mightily disappointed. And he said, nothing like you see on the TV. This person was an actor, nothing like. Very, very boring, very plain. And I said, well, they're actors, aren't they? He's acting a part. The whole point of acting is to take on a different personality and persona. And that's what acting is. I said, he was acting a part. And, certainly for people who've played, sometimes people play murderers, all sorts of parts, or tragic characters. I mean, the Greek playwright who developed the way that plays and TV are written. They develop pathos and angry characters.
Yeah.
And it might be that you meet that client as the character, not the person. It's mightily tricky.
Yes.
Mightily tricky. And it needs supervision. In the case of my supervisee, we chewed over for a long period of time, what may be the dangers of working with a celebrity. And one of them was curiosity. Might look them up on the internet. Are they mentioning they go into therapy? Because that'd be me. So we don't want to do that. And to be fair, the person I was working with wouldn't have done that and didn't indicate they were doing that. But also, how to actually see the person. And it was very well managed. My supervisor managed it brilliantly. And of course, this echoed through into my supervision, because I said to my supervisor, I've got a supervisee who's supervising the celebrity. So that generated a discussion in my supervision about how I was working with my supervisee. And as I said at the beginning of the piece, there's more people in the public eye, more people familiar to millions now than ever before. And I think, there's a good chance that in the arc of your practice, you may come across somebody who's familiar to millions.
Yeah. As a curtain call to this topic, Rory, I love how you were speaking about the Greek playwrights and how they develop the character. And we love to hate certain characters. And an example of this from my frame of reference, recently, the Counselling Tutor team met up live. We all come together because we work so much remotely. And one of the activities that we did was we went to go and watch a play. And the play was The Lion King. Beautiful play, and we had a lovely time watching that. But in The Lion King, there's a baddie. I think his name is Scar or something. He's the one that kills Simba's dad. And it was really interesting that at the end of the play, all of these actors had worked so hard. They come on for their curtain call. So they're coming on. They're no longer the character. They're now, hello, here I am. I'm the actor. And we are thanking them by clapping our hands and applauding for the actors. When the person who played Scar comes on, the whole audience were going, boo! And I get that it was, good-natured and nobody really believed that. But it just shows how we buy into characters. If you think of pantomime, we really buy into those characters. And I think that the media is so successful because we buy in and we almost live through. When we're watching a television program or something like that, it disappears, stops not being real, becomes real, even though we know it's not real. Yeah. And I guess it's untangling all of that, being able to see the real person in front of us. It's about taking off blinkers. It's about removing filters. I think it's about self-development. And I certainly, if I was working with someone that I knew in some way, shape, or form, from a celebrity kind of angle, I'd be at my supervisor very, very quickly saying, how do I work really carefully to avoid my own blind spots while working with this person? And I guess, Rory, what we do is we just have the topics. We bring up the topics. We don't have all the answers, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So get into that Facebook group, Counselling Tutor Facebook group, have the discussion. Let's hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to finish that, the Lion King theme off, where I was sitting when the Scar character came on, initially everybody clapped. They went, yay, and then they went, boo. And he took it in good. He must have heard this every single night, for the entire run, and he thought it was really funny. But it just goes to prove, doesn't it, how even in such a short duration of time, being introduced to a character can incite feelings so strong that at the end we forget the people are just actors, they're players on a stage, and we invest ourselves in the characters. And I think if I want to get people to take away anything, it's to de-invest yourself of who you believe that person is, and actually be curious as you would with any other client and discover who that person is.
Thank you. Great topic. Thank you, Rory. That is our practice today. We now move into Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor podcast. And Rory, you met up with Catherine Samson. Psychotherapeutic needs of mothers returning to work after maternity leave.
Yes, absolutely. And, this is a very important part of, I guess, of our society. Women have children, and then they some of them choose to go back to work, and as such, there can be specific needs that mothers of children find quite tricky, that they need support with. And I spoke with Catherine Samson, and she outlined the psychotherapeutic needs, and specifically on what we need to think about. And this is what she had to say. And we welcome Catherine Samson, who is doing some research on the psychotherapeutic needs of mothers returning to work after maternity leave. Kathy, welcome.
Thank you, Rory. Good to be with you.
So we talked a little bit before we recorded the podcast, before we pressed the record button, about keeping in touch days. And you've done some research, a big body of research, regarding women returning to work and the keeping in touch days, which are days where a woman can go back to work when she's on maternity leave, just to keep in touch, just to touch base. So I'm guessing the idea is that it's not such a big transition from moving to maternity leave back in to work. Mm-hmm. So what did your research uncover?
Yes, well, I started with some small-scale research to look at generally the returning experience of first-time mothers. And during it, I was expecting these keeping in touch days to be really, really useful as a platform to get mothers ready for that return emotionally, as well as practically as well. But I actually found that they weren't that useful to the mother, in fact, and that was a big surprise. So I've extended my research to look more broadly at this and more in depth about the value of the keeping in touch days themselves. And I'm just about to take this into the bigger scale research part, which will include a survey out to broad spectrum of mothers returning. But my feelings on it are also coming from being a mother myself. I've returned from maternity 3 times, and it hasn't been optimal. I did find myself plateauing, almost grateful to be in the job at all. And I can't help but think that there has to be a better platform. Why not go back and be ready to take your career where it was going to go anyway? So you've got the trajectory. So what I'm finding so far is that there's a broad range of emotions. And this is where I think counsellors come in, because you may be working with mothers returning to work yourself. What I'm finding so far, and the survey will help develop this, is that there's a range of negative and positive emotions, as you might expect. And as a result, the woman can feel quite conflicted. I've had people in the research so far saying they were really grateful, they were finding themselves again, but it came tinged with guilt as well, because they'd been 24/7 with their child or children, yes, if it's more than one. So that's what I'm finding so far, Rory.
Yes, it's almost a duality here, isn't it? Wanting to get back into the world of work and resume careers and aspirations, but that kind of separation anxiety, and maybe, if I may use the word, a little guilt in leaving behind their children, to whom they've spent so much time with over maternity leave. Yeah. So, how does that, I was wondering how that impacts on therapists who may work with female clients who are experiencing this?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's an understanding of that unusual situation a mother finds herself in. She's returning to work when often colleagues, for them, time has probably flown, and it doesn't seem like she's been off. Their lives haven't changed in the same way hers has. And I think what gets forgotten is that so many small things have changed. And as in aggregation, that can mean quite a big change she's not aware of. So there is that trepidation, anxiety. Guilt has been mentioned too, yes. Absolutely. But also finding, some anxiety, lack of confidence. And so I think a counsellor, therapist can actually help recognise the almost unique situation she's going back into, because she's not a new joiner. A lot is expected of her often.
Yes, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because when you're a new hire, you get an awful lot of latitude, don't you? Because you're learning the ropes, as we would say in the north of England. You're learning the ropes. But when you're an established member of a team, you come back after a gap, and you're absolutely right. For you, time has stopped. For the mother, time will have stopped. The focus will be on the child and what goes on around the child. But businesses move at such a rapid pace now that it must feel almost like starting again when a woman goes back. However, I'm guessing that the latitude of, they're a new starter isn't there. So it's an awful lot of pressure.
That's it. You expected to pick up where you left off in many cases. A lot depends on the quality of the manager, I think, in terms of recognizing this. But it's that what you don't know,
yes,
which might come back and sort of bite you several months in when you're doing something the old way and you realize things have moved on. So it can be quite a scary time, I think, for mothers going back.
It can be, and I think this is not a very well explored area psychotherapeutically. So I think you are definitely cutting or ploughing new ground here. And, certainly from my female friends who have left their careers or paused their careers and then they've gone back, they talk about separation anxiety. They talk about feeling a little bit left behind when they come back to work. And also, of course, they're coming back to work as certainly for new mothers, as new mothers and employees. And that's a different dynamic again, isn't it?
It is the taking on of new roles. And, if you think about the skill set a mother has developed when she goes back, probably her time management skills are better. She's better at juggling. She's got all those separate roles. And that is a great asset to a company if they know how to leverage it well as well. But yeah, she's going back almost not quite a different person, but with a very different set of experiences than when she left.
Yes, absolutely. I'm curious. I'm going to ask you what do you hope that your research, your wider research, you've already done a pilot research, if we can use that term. Yes. Your wider research will uncover, and what do you hope it will influence?
Yeah, thank you for asking. What I'm creating are some products around this. Now, one of them will be a module for counsellors to help them, but also for managers and companies. So anybody who's involved, and of course, the mothers themselves. So really getting the message out there of how things can improve. Because if those keeping in touch days can be designed correctly, they can be a great springboard. So instead of them being neutral or even detrimental, let's have the woman return to work the most optimally prepared she can be emotionally as well as practically. So that's my hope, that she actually gets there day one when she's back permanently, and she can just fly from there. She can pick up her career where she left it.
Yeah, so you're hoping that you're going to produce some kind of training or information pack, which
Yes.
which may be used to human resources, people
Yeah.
who employ, and indeed the women themselves. I mean, I think from a therapist's point of view, you bring up a very interesting point, because of course women's rights have been very hard fought for in terms of well, in every area, let's be clear on that. And I think this is a really interesting area. It's not one that I've ever spoken to anybody in a professional capacity about. I've had lots of conversations with female friends who have spoken about this, but no one who's kind of overviewed it and informed HR or HR procedures or employment procedures. I wonder, as we kind of come to the end of this podcast or this interview, if there's any mothers out there listening, I'm sure there must be lots of mothers who are on maternity leave. Have you got any sage observations for them?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think it's, be prepared for that range of emotions. Take some control of it as well. I found that mothers were going back to often very unstructured days where they were left to their own devices to design them. Get some input. One mother booked complete back-to-back meetings, wanting to look as efficient as possible, and that was really hard on her. So, be careful, be judicious about how you do it, but probably structure it so you're seeing the right people, talking to the right people, catching up, ask people about change, because that's going to be the thing that probably will nag away at you through anxiety. So I think those would be my tips, Rory.
Well, I think those are very sage pieces of advice. And as always, Catherine Samson, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Catherine. Big thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, for holding those important discussions. And a little bird whispered in my ear and suggested that we may actually in the future have a lecture coming up from Catherine Samson. It's not been 100% confirmed yet, Rory, but it's worth looking out for if you are a member of our Counsellor CPD library.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a really, really good interview and a really important piece of work, something I think that's sometimes forgotten, within the scope of helping people, psychologically and therapeutically.
Sorry, Rory, I interrupted you there.
Yes. So, yes, thank you, Ken. I'm stealing your thunder here. So this has been episode 254 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And we started off with Theory and Practice, the art of closing a counselling session, where we talked about deliberate practice. Then we moved into Practice Today, counselling celebrities or people in the public eye. And finally, in Practice Matters, we caught up with Catherine Samson, who talks about the psychotherapeutic needs of mothers returning to work after maternity leave. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.